The ambient temperature in the sub-level server farm was permanently locked at 62 degrees, a harsh, dry cold that smelled faintly of ozone, heated copper, and impending disaster. I sat perfectly still in the ergonomic mesh chair, my eyes tracking the endless, cascading lines of hexadecimal code reflecting off the dual matte monitors, while a localized packet loss anomaly quietly threatened to dismantle a $500 million logistics empire. It was 2 in the morning on a Thursday. The Chicago wind was howling a low, mournful note against the reinforced glass of the 72nd floor, and someone within the company's inner circle was systematically bleeding our proprietary database dry. I didn't blink as I isolated the unauthorized data stream. Blinking meant missing a microsecond of the routing path, and the phantom user pulling this data was a professional. My knuckles were white against the edge of the mechanical keyboard. I traced the anomalous UDP traffic, watching it bypass the secondary firewall through a dormant legacy service account. Whoever was doing this had elevated the account's permissions manually, wrapping their digital footprints in a spoofed IP mask that bounced through 3 offshore proxies before hitting our local intranet. They were good, but they were operating in my house now. I leaned forward, my spine popping in the heavy silence, and began writing a localized containment script. The rhythmic, heavy clacking of the mechanical keys was the only sound in the cavernous room, a solitary drumbeat against the hum of the cooling fans. I was halfway through compiling the execution command when the heavy magnetic lock on the primary glass door disengaged with a sharp electronic clack. I didn't turn around. My focus remained entirely locked on the command prompt. The heavy door swung open, and the rhythmic sound of heels against the polished concrete floor echoed through the server racks. The scent of the room shifted, the sterile ozone suddenly undercut by the faint, unmistakable notes of bergamot and sheer exhaustion. "You're still here, Dean." The voice was low, carrying a jagged edge of fatigue that hadn't been there yesterday. I finally rotated the chair, my boots scraping softly against the floor. Isabel Joseph, the CEO of the firm and the architect of the empire currently under digital siege, walked into the pale blue light of the workstation. She wasn't wearing her usual immaculate boardroom armor. She wore a deep burgundy dress, the fabric gathering slightly as she moved, carrying a stack of printed server manifests in one hand and a half-empty glass of white wine in the other. She didn't stop at the visitor's perimeter. She walked directly into my operational footprint, dropping the heavy stack of papers onto the corner of my desk with a heavy thud. Then, moving with a weary, deliberate grace, she leaned back and sat right on the edge of the desk. The movement brought her squarely into my line of sight, the ambient light catching the sheer exhaustion in the dark circles under her eyes. She crossed her legs, the motion causing the burgundy fabric to shift, settling around her as she rested her hands lightly on the edge of the laminate surface. I remained seated, the back of my gray t-shirt pressed firmly against the mesh of the chair. I kept my hands resting entirely flat on the armrests, creating a physical boundary through absolute stillness. The proximity was jarring in the empty, silent room. She took a slow sip of the wine, her eyes tracking my rigid posture. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the servers and the distant rattle of the Chicago wind. My boss sat on my desk and asked, "Why do you always look away first?" Her question wasn't flirtatious. It was an exhausted demand for an anchor in a room that was spinning out of her control. I looked at the slight tremor in her fingers against the stem of the wine glass. I looked at the rigid, defensive set of her jaw. I did not look at the neckline of the burgundy dress. I looked directly into her dark, tired eyes, holding her gaze for 3 steady seconds before deliberately shifting my focus back to the primary monitor. "Because looking at you doesn't secure the perimeter, Ms. Joseph," I stated, my voice completely flat, stripping the tension out of the air like a localized vacuum. And right now, someone is currently attempting to extract 60 terabytes of proprietary routing algorithms through a compromised port. A shaky exhale escaped her lips, the sound of a woman who had been holding her breath for 3 consecutive days. "Marcus," she whispered, the name dropping like a stone. "I don't have definitive proof it's him yet," I replied, typing a 14-character string into the terminal to freeze the outgoing cache. But the extraction protocol was initiated from a subnet allocated to the senior board members. The leak is designed to leave a digital signature that matches your administrative credentials. She closed her eyes, her head tilting back slightly as the weight of the sabotage settled over her. "He filed a formal grievance with the board this afternoon," she said, her voice hollow. "He claimed he has documented complaints from the engineering team regarding my lack of oversight on the cloud infrastructure. He called for an emergency board vote next Friday. If this data leak goes public before then, and it has my signature on it, he'll have the votes to trigger the morality clause. He'll take the company." I didn't offer a sympathetic grimace. Empathy in this room was a useless metric. I reached for the mouse, opening a secure, isolated sandbox environment. "Then we don't let it go public. Dean, if he has my credentials, he has the keys to the entire architecture. We have to shut down the external ports. Now! Cut the hard lines if you have to." The panic was rising in her chest, a visible tightening of her posture. She reached toward the keyboard, a desperate instinct to stop the bleed. I moved my hand, intercepting hers before she could touch the keys. I didn't hold her hand. I simply placed my palm flat against the desk, creating a physical barrier between her fingers and the terminal. The touch was brief, grounding, entirely functional. "If we cut the hard lines, the automated failsafe in his script will recognize the sever," I explained, keeping my tone slow, methodical, and completely devoid of panic. "It will wipe the ghost account, delete the routing history, and we will never be able to prove he planted it. You will be left holding a severed network and a forged signature." She pulled her hand back, her breathing shallow. "Then what do we do? Just watch him steal it?" "No." I rotated back to the screens, my fingers flying across the keys. "We build him a mirror. I am creating a localized, shadow environment that perfectly mimics the primary database. When his script tries to pull the data at 0300 hours, I will reroute his connection into the sandbox. He will think he is downloading the logistics algorithms. He will actually be downloading a string of encrypted garbage data, while my system logs his exact MAC address, his real IP, and every keystroke he executes." I hit the Enter key. A progress bar appeared on the screen, verifying the sandbox parameters. I looked up at her. "He thinks he has a blind spot. I'm going to let him step into it. Process over panic, Isabel. I handle the network. You handle the board." She stared at me. The chaotic, spinning panic in her eyes met the absolute concrete wall of my process, and the tremor in her hands slowly ceased. It was a transfer of stability, invisible but massive. She gave a single sharp nod, stepping off the edge of the desk. The burgundy dress fell back into place. "How long will it take to build the mirror?" she asked, her voice returning to its normal, commanding cadence. 72 hours of continuous coding, I answered honestly. "I can't leave this terminal. If the latency fluctuates by more than 10 milliseconds, his script will abort." She looked at the harsh fluorescent lighting, the cold concrete floor, and then down at me. "Then we work from here." For the next 3 days, the server sublevel became a pressurized containment zone. The corporate protocol mandated that any suspected breach be immediately reported to the Risk Management Committee, but reporting a breach that carried Isabel's forged signature would be corporate suicide. We were operating under a strict self-imposed quarantine. She canceled her public appearances, moving her entire operational base to the small metal folding table situated 10 feet behind my workstation. The proximity was a constant, low-level friction. The room was not designed for human comfort. It was a machine environment. At 0400 hours on Saturday morning, the physical toll of the environment was impossible to ignore. My eyes felt like they were coated in sand. The base of my neck burned from the rigid, unyielding posture required to monitor the incoming packet streams. I was in the middle of writing a custom Python script to mask the latency of the shadow server when a steaming, ceramic mug appeared in my peripheral vision. I stopped typing. Isabel stood beside my chair, wearing a pair of faded jeans and an oversized gray sweater that swallowed her frame. The high-powered CEO was gone. She was just a woman fighting a war of attrition in a freezing basement. She placed the mug of black coffee onto a designated safe zone on the desk, far from the electronics. "You haven't moved in 6 hours," she noted quietly. "The script requires manual calibration," I replied, my voice raspy from disuse. I picked up the mug. The ceramic was incredibly hot, radiating a sudden, intense warmth that seeped into my freezing palms. It was a micro-joy, a sudden, sharp relief against the sterile cold of the room. "Thank you." She didn't walk back to her table. She stood there, wrapping her arms around her own ribs, shivering slightly as the industrial air conditioning cycled on, blasting a fresh wave of 62-degree air over us. I set the mug down. I didn't say a word. I simply reached under the desk, unlocked the manual override for the environmental controls for our specific grid, and bumped the ambient temperature up by 4 degrees. The massive vents above us shuddered, the airflow slowing to a quiet, manageable hum. She noticed the sudden absence of the freezing draft. She looked up at the vents, then down at the small control panel near my knee. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth. It didn't reach her eyes. She was too tired for that. But it was real. "You don't miss anything, do you, Dean?" she murmured, pulling the sweater tighter around herself. "It's my job to observe anomalies," I said plainly, turning back to the screen. I didn't offer a poetic compliment. I didn't tell her that the way she fought for her company was the most compelling thing I had ever witnessed. I just made the room livable for her and went back to work. By Monday evening, the silence between us had evolved. It was no longer the tense, suffocating quiet of a crisis. It had become a shared, functional rhythm. She would review legal precedents on her tablet, the soft tap of her stylus providing a steady backbeat to the aggressive clacking of my mechanical keyboard. We were 70 hours into the quarantine. The shadow server was fully operational, humming invisibly alongside the primary database. We were simply waiting for Marcus's script to trigger its scheduled extraction. At 2100 hours, the primary monitor flashed a sudden, violent yellow. It wasn't the database extraction. It was a completely different vector. "Dean," Isabel said, her voice snapping like a dry branch behind me. I spun the chair around. She was standing at the metal table, staring at her tablet, her face drained of all color. "He didn't wait," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He didn't wait for the extraction." I stood up, crossing the 10 feet between us in 3 strides. I looked over her shoulder at the illuminated screen of the tablet. It was a mass email sent to the entire senior executive tier, the board of directors, and the primary investors. The sender was an anonymous, encrypted address. Attached to the email was a highly confidential draft version of a massive restructuring contract, a contract that Isabel had explicitly vetoed and buried 3 months ago because it would have laid off 20% of the workforce. The subject line read, "The future of the firm under Joseph's leadership." "He triggered a dead man's switch on my personal drive," Isabel said, her breathing accelerating into a shallow, panicked rhythm. "He couldn't get the database yet, so he bypassed the system and leaked the restructuring draft. The board will read this. The investors will read this. They'll think I've been lying to them for months." She dropped the tablet onto the metal table. The clatter was deafening in the quiet room. She took a step back, her hands coming up to cover her face. "It's over. If I walk into that boardroom on Friday, they will tear me apart. I have to draft a resignation letter tonight. If I step down immediately, maybe I can salvage the severance packages for the employees. She reached for her phone, her thumb hovering over the dial pad to call her executive assistant. Stop. The word was not a request. It was a concrete wall. I stepped directly into her path, forcing her to look up from the phone. The chaotic, spiraling energy in her eyes was overwhelming, a complete structural collapse of her confidence. You are not resigning, I said, my voice low, dropping an anchor into the center of the room. Dean, you don't understand the optics of this. I understand the network logic, I interrupted, refusing to let her finish the sentence. Look at me, Isabel. She stopped, her dark eyes locking onto mine, wide with raw, unfiltered fear. This was the vulnerability moment. The armor was completely stripped away, leaving only the terrified realization that she was about to lose everything she had spent her life building. Look at the timestamp on that email, I instructed, pointing a single finger at the tablet on the table. He didn't trigger this manually. The origin code on that email blast is a delayed execution script. It fired automatically. Why? She demanded, her voice cracking. Because 72 hours ago, I locked down the primary database, I explained, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact. His primary extraction script failed to connect to the real servers because I walled them off. When his script hit a dead end, it panicked. It triggered the secondary payload, the email blast, as a distraction. I took a slow breath, ensuring my tone was entirely steady. He doesn't have the client data. He never got it. This email is a smokescreen because he knows his primary weapon is jammed. He is blind, Isabel. And tomorrow night, when his script tries to reconnect, it's going to hit my mirror. And I will have his IP address. She stared at me, the logic slowly penetrating the panic. The silence in the room returned, thick and heavy. Without warning, her shoulders collapsed. She swayed slightly on her feet, the adrenaline leaving her system in a sudden, violent rush. She stepped forward, closing the final 2 feet between us, and wrapped her arms around my torso. She pressed her face against the center of my chest, burying herself in the rough cotton of the gray t-shirt. I didn't immediately wrap my arms around her. I froze, my hands hovering awkwardly in the cold air. The contact was startling. I didn't focus on the softness of her body or the scent of her hair. I focused on the sudden, profound stillness that settled over my own mind. The chaotic noise of the servers, the pressure of the deadline, the freezing air of the sublevel, it was all physically blocked out by the simple geometry of the embrace. It was the principle of the quiet room. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered my arms, resting my hands lightly against her upper back. I didn't stroke her spine. I simply held her there, acting as a physical brace against gravity. I'm terrified, Dean, she whispered against my chest, the words barely audible over the hum of the machines. I know, I replied quietly. But you are safe. We stayed like that for 30 seconds, no longer. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red, but the panic was gone, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. What's the next step? She asked. We wait for 0300 hours, I said, turning back to the workstation. We trap him. Wednesday night was an exercise in pure endurance. The email leak had thrown the entire executive floor into chaos. Sarah, Isabel's confidant and executive assistant, was frantically managing the fallout, fielding calls from angry investors and confused department heads. Isabel remained in the sublevel, refusing to leave the perimeter. At 02:55 hours, the tension in the room was palpable, a physical weight pressing against the eardrums. I was staring at the command prompt, my fingers hovering over the keys. 5 minutes, I muttered, my eyes burning. Isabel stood directly behind my chair, her hands gripping the plastic backrest so tightly her knuckles were white. 0258 hours. 0259 hours. 0300 hours. The secondary monitor flashed a brilliant, violent green. Incoming connection detected. IP spoofing engaged. Rerouting to sandbox. The text scrolled across the screen at lightning speed. Marcus's automated script had woken up. It was blindly reaching out in the dark, searching for the massive vault of client data. It hit my shadow server. "He's in," I said, my voice entirely flat. The sandbox accepted the connection. He thinks he's pulling the real database. "Are you logging it?" Isabel demanded, her voice tight. "Logging every packet," I confirmed, my fingers flying across the keyboard to initiate the deep trace protocol. I watched the progress bar on the extraction. He was downloading the encrypted garbage data I had prepared. While his system was occupied with the massive file transfer, my trace script bypassed his offshore proxies, tearing through the spoofed IP layers one by one. Proxy 1, shattered. Proxy 2, shattered. Proxy 3. The terminal hung for an agonizing 3 seconds. The cursor blinked, a mocking, rhythmic pulse. If the trace failed here, we had nothing. "Come on," I whispered, the first display of emotion I had shown in 4 days. The screen flickered. A new line of text appeared. "Trace complete. Origin, IP verified." I hit the print screen command, instantly generating a cryptographically sealed hash of the log file. I leaned back in the chair, the tension draining out of my muscles, leaving behind a deep, hollow ache. I looked up at Isabel. "Got him," she exhaled sharply, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. "Where's it pointing?" I pulled up the registry data. The IP address resolves to a private, high-speed fiber connection registered to a residential address in Lake Forest. The account holder is Marcus Thorne. She stared at the screen, her eyes tracing the undeniable mathematical proof of his betrayal. The ghost was finally caught on camera. "Print it," she ordered, her voice cold as the concrete floor. "Print the entire chain of custody. We are bringing a firing squad to the board meeting on Friday." Thursday was dedicated to preparation. I compiled the digital evidence into a localized encrypted presentation format that could not be altered or questioned by external auditors. Isabel spent the day on secure, encrypted calls with Sarah, quietly mapping out the political battlefield of the boardroom. By Thursday evening, the physical exhaustion was overwhelming. We had been living in the sublevel for nearly a week. The air felt stale. I was finalizing the encryption keys when Isabel walked over to the desk. She placed a small silver flash drive down next to my keyboard. "Load the presentation onto this," she said quietly. I picked up the drive, noting the heavy, metallic weight of it. "It's ready." She looked at me, her dark eyes entirely serious. "Dean, tomorrow morning, Marcus is going to walk into that room and attempt to destroy my career. He is going to present that draft contract as proof of my incompetence, and he is going to demand a vote of no confidence. When he does, I need you in that room." I stopped. "I am infrastructure, Isabel. I don't go to board meetings." "You do tomorrow," she stated, leaving no room for argument. "You are the only person who can verify the cryptographic hashes. You are the only person who can explain the trace without him twisting the technical jargon into a defense. I need you there." She wasn't asking me to be a prop. She was asking me to be the shield. "Okay," I said plainly. Friday morning arrived with the harsh, unforgiving light of a corporate execution. The boardroom on the 80th floor was a cavern of polished glass, cold marble, and expensive mahogany. The 12 members of the board of directors sat in their heavy leather chairs, their expressions grim and impatient. Marcus sat at the far end of the long table, his posture radiating a quiet, venomous confidence. He had a thick binder of printed documents placed squarely in front of him. Isabel stood at the head of the table. She wore a tailored, charcoal gray suit, her posture impeccable, betraying none of the exhaustion of the past week. She looked like a general commanding a battlefield. I stood silently by the heavy oak doors positioned just outside the main seating area, holding a plain black laptop. I wore my usual dark jeans and a black button-down shirt. I was out of place in the sea of bespoke suits, and I didn't care. I was the hired ghost. Marcus didn't waste time. He stood up, adjusting his tie, and launched into his rehearsed narrative. He spoke of accountability. He spoke of the critical vulnerabilities in the cloud infrastructure under Isabel's direct supervision. He projected the leaked restructuring contract onto the massive screen behind Isabel, letting the damaging optics fill the room. This board cannot, in good conscience, allow a CEO who leaves proprietary strategic data vulnerable on a personal drive to continue leading this firm, Marcus concluded, his voice ringing with practiced indignation. The negligence is staggering. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence effective today. The room was silent. Several board members nodded slowly. The trap successfully sprung. Isabel didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked down the length of the table at Marcus. Before the board entertains a vote regarding my alleged negligence, Isabel said, her voice cutting through the heavy air with calm, measured authority, I believe we should review the actual origin of the data breach. Marcus offered a patronizing smile. Isabel, the email logs clearly show the document originated from your personal restricted directory. The trail is undeniable. The trail, Isabel interrupted, her tone dropping 10 degrees in temperature, shows a spoofed credential. A credential that was traced, mapped, and secured. A credential that was utilized in a failed attempt to extract the entire client logistics database. Marcus's patronizing smile faltered slightly, a microscopic twitch in his jaw. Isabel didn't look back at me, but she held out her hand, palm up. It was the signal. I walked forward. The heavy thud of my boots against the marble floor echoed in the silent room. I approached the head of the table. I didn't look at Marcus. I didn't look at the confused faces of the board members. I looked only at Isabel. I placed the silver encrypted flash drive directly into her open palm. Isabel plugged the drive into the central console. She tapped the screen twice. The massive display behind her shifted. The image of the leaked contract vanished, replaced by the stark, undeniable architecture of a terminal command prompt. Lines of green text, timestamps, and IP addresses filled the screen. This is a verified, cryptographically sealed chain of custody log, Isabel explained to the silent room, her voice steady and commanding. She pulled up the specific documentation, the receipts of his manipulation. It details the exact pathway of the unauthorized script that infiltrated our network last week. It logs the exact minute a legacy update protocol was weaponized to bypass our secondary firewall. She tapped the screen again. A map graphic appeared, tracing a red line from the company servers through the offshore proxies and terminating at a single, blinking red dot. And, Isabel continued, her voice turning into a blade, it traces the origin IP address directly to a private, residential fiber network, a network registered to Marcus Thorne. The boardroom erupted into a chaotic murmur. Several directors leaned forward, staring at the screen in disbelief. Marcus stood up, his chair scraping violently against the marble floor. His face was flushed a dark, angry red. This is fabricated. This is a desperate, illegal attempt by a failing executive to frame me with doctored logs. You had your pet hacker mock this up. The logs are cryptographically sealed via an immutable blockchain hash, I stated. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the marble room like a gavel strike. The murmuring instantly ceased. I stepped slightly to the side, placing myself physically between Marcus's line of sight and Isabel. I didn't raise my hands. I didn't adopt an aggressive posture. I just stood there, an immovable, grounded object. Any independent third-party auditor will verify the hashes, I continued, speaking directly to the board, my tone instructional and completely devoid of emotion. The timestamps on the server-side architecture cannot be altered retroactively. The latency records match the physical distance of the proxy routing. The data is absolute. The extraction was attempted from Mr. Thorne's residence. Marcus looked from the screen to the silent, staring board members and finally to me. He opened his mouth to argue, to deploy his usual corporate rhetoric, but he saw the cold, unyielding reality of the numbers. He couldn't spin hex code. He couldn't gaslight a cryptographic hash. The undeniable proof of his own trap had snapped shut on him, in public, with witnesses. He didn't say another word. He picked up his leather briefcase, his movements stiff and jerky, and walked out of the heavy oak doors without looking back. The silence that followed was entirely different from the silence of the server room. It was the silence of a massive structure that had been severely tested and had held firm. Isabel looked around the table, taking absolute command of the space she had just secured. "The external audit is canceled," she announced, her voice leaving no room for debate. "The infrastructure is secure. The board will convene a special ethics committee this afternoon to handle Mr. Thorne's immediate removal and the subsequent legal filings." She paused, turning her head slightly to look directly at me. It was a public, undeniable acknowledgement. "Furthermore," she stated, addressing the board but keeping her eyes locked on mine, "effective immediately, Dean White is no longer an external contractor. He is the permanent executive director of information security for this firm." She didn't ask me to shrink my life to fit hers. She offered a space, a permanent anchor where I belonged. She made the choice in front of 12 witnesses. The falling action was a blur of practical logistics. The board adjourned in a state of shock. Legal teams were mobilized. Sarah began drafting the internal press releases. At 1900 hours, the executive floor was finally quiet. The adrenaline of the confrontation had burned off, leaving behind a deep, satisfying exhaustion. I was in the sub-level, packing up the temporary workstation on the metal folding table. I was coiling the heavy Ethernet cables, preparing to move my equipment to the permanent executive office down the hall. The magnetic lock on the glass door clicked open. Isabel walked in. She wasn't wearing the armor of the CEO anymore. The charcoal suit jacket was gone, her white blouse unbuttoned at the collar. She looked relaxed. The heavy, suffocating burden finally lifted from her shoulders. She walked up to the workstation, stopping at the boundary line of the desk. She didn't sit on it this time. She stood there, waiting. I dropped the coiled cable onto the desk. I didn't look away. I didn't focus on the monitors or the hex code. I looked at the profound, quiet relief in her eyes. I took the single step necessary to cross the distance between us. When I kissed her, it wasn't frantic or desperate or hungry. It was the principle of the arrival. It was heavy, grounding, and absolute. It was the feeling of locking a heavy door against a chaotic storm, dropping an anchor into solid rock. It was the final, quiet certainty of coming home. The world outside the high-rise could howl all it wanted. In this room, the architecture was sound. I learned that trust isn't about blind faith. It's about building a secure architecture together. Love isn't about holding on tight. It's about knowing they will come back if you let go. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.